Welcome everybody, and hope you're having a good lunch. Glad to see you all here. My name is Laurent Dubois. I want to welcome you to the space, the Forum for Scholars and Publics. I'm going to pass around a mailing list if you want to find out about other events we're having like this one. And I'm going to introduce David Goldblatt, who I'm really delighted to be able to greet here. He's someone who I think really exemplifies the possibilities of moving between journalism, scholarship, the public sphere. A real public intellectual who's really shaped the way that we think about soccer globally. David has a great story, has a background in social theory and sociology, worked at the Open University, taught at the Open University, and then basically gave that up to begin writing about soccer, writing soccer almanacs, and then a 900-page book that my undergraduates have to read in my class called The Ball is Round, which is really the definitive history of global soccer that's out today. He's also someone who works for the BBC. He writes for a wide range of media outlets. He currently just finished a book about English football since the Hillsborough disaster, which is out when?
Actually, it's coming out next August.
Okay, coming out next August.
Brazil first.
Okay, and he's still writing a book which will come out in January about Brazilian football. And his books are getting progressively shorter, he tells me. Brazilian ones are only 150 pages. And so he'll be speaking today about last year's Confederations Cup in Brazil, but more broadly about how to think about the Brazilian World Cup and what's going on in global football. So please join me in welcoming David Goldblatt.
Thank you. Well, how lovely to see you all. Thank you very much for coming to hear me. It's a great honour and a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to start with an apology, because some of you quite rightly may be under the misapprehension that you were going to see some Brazilian football, and that we were going to talk about the king of all football cliches, Jogo Bonito, the beautiful game. And I'm terribly sorry to say there won't be any football today. There won't be any beautiful game. And that is because while at one point, somewhere between the mid-1950s perhaps and 1970, Brazilian football was pretty beautiful and did represent, in many ways, the very best of Brazilian culture and Brazilian society. The truth is, 6-7 months from the 2014 Brazilian World Cup, is that football in Brazil has come to represent every worst aspect of Brazilian society, culture and politics. And just to give you a kind of an entree into that, a sense of that, I'm going to show you a short clip. And it's from last year, and it's at a youth tournament, final of a youth tournament in Sao Paulo. And it was shown live on television. It wasn't a huge game, but it was shown live on television. And I'm going to show you the medal ceremony, where the medals are handed out to the winners. And I want you to focus on a small, balding, rather tubby gentleman whose name is Jose Maria Marin. And Jose Maria Marin has a dual function. He is the president of the Brazilian Football Federation, and he is the man in charge of the organising committee of the Brazilian World Cup in 2014. He was in a previous life a politician in the military's faux political party arena in the 1970s, and as he himself says, the less said about that, the better. So I just want you to watch this piece that was broadcast, I would say, probably every 10 minutes for 2 or 3 days. This particularly good version is from ESPN Brazil. Do watch the arrow.
Sair numa final de Copa São Paulo, acho que é só por ordem. E como é ordem, a gente acata. O professor Narciso é muito iluminado, colocou o Ravi, pegou 2 bolas. A gente foi lá e não precisou nem de pênalti, então...
So just for those of you who are not familiar, just to put it in an American context, let's imagine the lovely Bud Selig handing out the rings at the end of the World Series, and live on television he takes somebody's ring and sticks it in his pocket. Now, he's not going to last 2 minutes, is he? That's it. That's the end of your career in sports administration. This gentleman was actually confronted about this incident on Brazilian television. His first instinct, of course, was just to deny it. Then he was told that it had been shown on Brazilian television possibly 3,000 or 4,000 times, at which point he said, oh, well, it's not important. And then finally, 3 days later, a letter was produced from a 17-year-old football player from the Sao Paulo side, claiming that it was a pre-arranged present from Mr. Marinho. And that was the end of the matter. And what strikes me about this, and I think this is characteristic not merely of Brazilian football administration, but Brazilian elite, contemporary Brazilian elite, is the utter contempt which they show for their own publics, a sense of extraordinary invulnerability to the rule of law. And this, to me, exemplifies many of the ways in which Brazilian football and Brazilian society currently operates. And just to give an example from beyond football, the governor of Rio State is a man called Cabral, and at about the same time that this was happening, maybe slightly later, a story broke about the use of his helicopter, and he has a helicopter that takes him from his rather lovely place in Leblon in Rio, the 4 kilometers to the Rio governor's office. And it turned out that this helicopter was making 5 or 6 flights every single day between Leblon and the governor's office. And the reasons were the nanny, they forgot to pick the nanny up, so they had to go back and get the nanny. Or, I said nappies the other day, but I believe diapers is the word here. Diapers. They didn't bring the diapers, so they sent the helicopter back to get the diapers, all at public expense. And when he was challenged on television about this, he said, quite straight-faced, he said, I don't understand what the problem is. Most governors have aeroplanes. That is the kind of character, that's the caliber of character that we're dealing with. Just in case any of you are in any doubt, I just want to reiterate for you simply how significant football has been in the formation of national identity and sense of self in Brazil over the last 70 to 100 years. I mean, one way of looking at it is, how do people view Brazil from outside? What does most of the world know of Brazil? And it's amazing for a society that is so culturally rich and diverse, that has an extraordinary tradition in the visual arts, in music, in writing, how little of this is actually known more widely. I mean, just take the question of cuisine, for example. Indian, Chinese and Thai cuisines are known worldwide. Brazilian cuisine is known hardly anywhere. I mean, certainly in Britain, I would say in the United States, it's a very rare thing. It doesn't really have much traction. Or let's take Brazilian literary figures, an extraordinary literary tradition. But then when you compare the reception of Brazilian writers with, say, Mario Vargas Llosa or Borges from Argentina, the global impact and the global knowledge of Brazilian writing is incredibly limited. Even samba, which is often spoken of in the same phrase, you know, Brazil is samba and football. How well actually is samba known around the world as a musical form? I would say by comparison to salsa, you know, it's hardly made any more. Or if you compare Brazilian popular music of the 60s and 70s with its African equivalents, the knowledge, the world spread of African music is much, much wider than Brazil. The one thing that unambiguously the world knows about Brazil is that it plays football and it plays in those extraordinary yellow shirts. You know? And I think it's worth noting, Nike, you know, thought it was worth paying up at least $150 million to have access to that shirt. And I would say actually that has redoubled the relationship in the public, the global public mind between the yellow shirt and football in a sense of national identity, because a lot more people, let's face it, have watched the Mash Nada advert where the Brazilian national team have a kick around in an airport, right, in a beautiful kind of way, by comparison to, I don't know, the literature of Mario de Andrade. You know, the yellow shirt is what people know. But this is also true inside Brazil. I mean, many countries over the years have come to define, at least in part, their national identity in relationship to football. Uruguay is an obvious example in the same region after winning the World Cup in 1930. But I would say in Brazil this has gone a stage further, and I find, you know, even a casual acquaintance with any form of both high or popular culture in Brazil reveals that football is ubiquitous in a way that no other culture is. I mean, just to give one example, in England, which is, you know, pretty football crazy as these things go, and certainly a place that increasingly has defined itself in relationship to the sport, in the visual arts, there is literally one picture of significance in the 20th century which features football, by R.S. Lowry, called Going to the Match. In Brazil, almost every single visual artist of the 20th century at some point has painted their football picture. Similarly, in poetry, you find everybody from Carlos Drummond de Andrade, the kind of mid-century poet laureate of Brazilian society, not merely wrote poems about football, but during each World Cup between 1958 and 1994, had a 30-day daily column in the most important newspaper in Brazil, writing about football. It's as if, it's like the equivalent of Robert Frost having a column every time the World Cup comes around, and taken very seriously, not as a kind of a gimmick, but as a given. You're a Brazilian public intellectual, then you're going to be writing about football in the 1950s and 1960s. So Brazil is, you know, if you want to take the temperature of the nation, then football is a fantastically good place to go. So what is the state of Brazilian football today? As I suggested, I have come to believe that football represents everything. Not really represents, but is actually a very practical example of some of the most pathological qualities of Brazil's current social system. So let's start at the top. Who ran Brazilian football before this gentleman, Jose Maria Marinho, was in charge? There are two key figures you need to know about: João Havelange and Ricardo Teixeira. João Havelange, who was a very successful aristocratic Franco-Belgian-Brazilian businessman of the 1950s, got his break in football when he became head of the Brazilian Football Federation in the late 1950s. And it was under Havelange that Brazil won the World Cup in 1958, went on to win it in 1962. And to be fair to the man, he brought a level of rigour, administration, organisation and focus that Brazilian football had never seen before, and at least he plays some significant part in that. But his mode of operation, his political mode of operation, was characteristic of the era. Nepotistic, clientelistic, utterly ruthless and manipulative, utterly self-centred. This would be of less significance to us if we were merely talking about the 1950s, but as you know, well know, João Havelange, on the back of Brazil's three great victories in the era of Pelé at the World Cup, got himself elected president of FIFA, and was president of FIFA between 1974 and 1998. And the politics of FIFA, which I'm sure you're aware of today, are dubious, to say the least. A political culture of secrecy and corruption was, without question, it is built in the image of João Havelange and the tradition of Brazilian politics that he came out of. Once again, Havelange is an extraordinary man. Don't get me wrong. It is under Havelange that the World Cup is turned from a little sporting carnival into a true global mega event. It is Havelange who effectively initiates modern forms of sponsorship at global sporting mega events. So the situation you have now, where you have, you know, a series of very large multinationals in one consumer segment, each paying up a very large amount of money for a whole 4-year period and coverage, which is the way the Olympics works. You know, there's one computer manufacturer, one credit card, one responsible drinking partner, as they're now called, but in the old days we just used to say beer. This is his creation. Somebody who realised that you could get billions of dollars for selling the television rights done correctly for the World Cup. Once again, Havelange is at the centre of this. He also, as I say, brought a tradition of ruthless secrecy and power mongering to FIFA. And it is worth noting that both Havelange and his successor in Brazil, Ricardo Teixeira, have both recently had to resign their various posts in the sporting world because, without a shadow of a doubt, they have been demonstrated to be guilty of very high-level corruption in the selling of FIFA's World Cup rights in the 1990s through ISL. And there is a document sitting in a variety of legal offices in Switzerland which shows very clearly that both Havelange and Teixeira, to the tune of around $10 million each, had that money passed to bank accounts in Andorra and Liechtenstein. And I'm sure you don't need to know that the Andorran banking system is not one of the most transparent in the world. And in fact, Havelange has had to resign from the IOC. He was a lifelong member of the IOC. He, in the wake of this, has had to resign. So he sets the tone back in the 70s and then takes it global. But his successor, I think, is more characteristic in a way of Brazilian football because he has all the venality of Havelange, but none of his class and none of his charisma. And that is Ricardo Teixeira, a man who had one thing on his CV that made him the right man for the job. And what was that? He's João Havelange's son-in-law. And that is the basis on which this man was allowed to run Brazilian football for nearly 20 years. He's currently sitting in Miami waiting to see whether he can get an Andorran passport to avoid the inevitable extradition laws that are coming his way. And Teixeira, just to give you an example of one of many, one of his sidelines was that he owned a ranch, a large cattle ranch that produced a lot of milk. And for over a decade, the Brazilian Football Federation purchased the entire output of milk from his ranches. What does the Brazilian Football Federation need with 100,000 litres of milk every day? You tell me. I don't see any Brazilian footballers drinking it in the last 20 years. I mean, it's so outrageous one doesn't really know where to begin. But, as is often the case in Brazil, you just get away with it. I mean, he was never touched for 20 years, and that is just the tip of the iceberg. So that's the calibre of person in charge of Brazilian football. Now let's take a little closer look at some of the other problems with it. Well, the first thing is the schedule. Brazil's football season starts in January, and it ends in December. Okay, we are talking a break last year of 4 days. Okay, in the schedule. I mean, this is extraordinary. Can you imagine, as an athlete, you get 4 days off in the year before you're back into the new season? And I'm pleased to say at last, Brazilian footballers have been organising themselves and campaigning this year and saying, this has got to stop. This is destroying our bodies. Now, as we know, Brazil has a long tradition of working people absolutely into the ground before they fall apart in a whole variety of different contexts. And this seems to me just the latest. And once again, the people who run Brazilian football are utterly contemptuous of the people that who work for them. You know, it's of no concern that the level of injuries in Brazilian football, the level of foreshortened careers, with all of the consequences economically that has for athletes, is of no concern. Why does Brazil play so much football? Well, again, it's down to politics, because in fact you actually have 2 football seasons in Brazil that are run into one. The first 3 months or so of the year are taken up with state championships, because as you know, Brazil is a federal polity, and there are 18 states who each run their own local tournament, which is where football, organised football, really began in Brazil. Because in the 1920s and 1930s, when football is really taking off as a mass participation sport, the idea of actually running the Brazilian National League is inconceivable. You know, how are you going to get to Recife from Porto Alegre when there are no aeroplanes? There's no train. There's no roads. It's impossible. Okay, so those are left. That's the original. And then what the Brazilians have done is then stick the National League on top of that. Now you might think, why are they bothering them with all of these like little Mickey Mouse state competitions, you know, where the big teams, you know, end up playing 3 months of the year against absolutely minuscule little tiny teams. So again, in American terms, it's as if in addition to the MLB season, You spent the whole of January to April with the Yankees playing in the New York League, where they're playing against teams in AA or maybe even A-level baseball before the big season begins. But this is a matter of politics, because as a federal country, and above all, a federal voting system within Brazilian politics, each state, right, has one vote. So Rio State's got one vote, but then, is it Sergipe? You pronounce it, tiny little state up in the north, you know, there's no money, nothing. They've got one vote as well. So you've just got to learn to play the politics of the federal system. The little guys have a kind of hold over it. That's where they make their money. And it's immovable at the moment. You know, and that goes for a lot of Brazilian politics. The schedule gets even worse, though, when you get into the little details of it. Because I'm going to Brazil in 2 weeks. And one of the things, obviously, I want to do while I'm in Rio is go and see the football. So what do? You go to the website and you go, good, what time and what day is this going to be? 2 weeks away from the game. We don't know. We know what the games will be that weekend, but we don't know, will it be Friday, Saturday, Sunday or Monday? And we don't know what time of day it will be. How can this be? How can you run a national football league and only be scheduling, okay, actually when the game is going to be 2 weeks in advance? Well, the answer, of course, is Globo, who control the way in which these things, they totally control the schedule. And Globo doesn't give a damn, because Globo fits all of those games around its telenovelas and where those telenovelas in the schedule are going to be. And they make the decision at the last minute. So you've got a situation where the schedule is being run by small federations in the outback of Brazil and Globo to the detriment of fans, players, and the whole feel of the season. Third problem with Brazilian football. We've talked about the people who actually run the federations. Let's talk for a moment about the cartolas. The cartolas, which is slang for the people who run the football clubs, and I believe it's derived from the Brazilian term for top hat, which would have been standard kind of millinery for the ruling class in the early part of the 20th century. You know, there's a lot of competition in the world for bad administrators and bad managers in football. There are no shortage of venal, corrupt, incompetent, egotistic people running football clubs. But really, Brazil is right up there with the very best of them. What we can say over the last 20 years is, first of all, the economic model on which these clubs have been run is an utter disaster. Not one of them is not in substantial levels of debt. And that is despite selling probably something in the region of 2,500 Brazilian football players overseas in the last decade alone. I mean, that's a lot of money to be coming into your football clubs and still be completely bust. This wouldn't be so bad, at least if they then use the money in some sort of relatively sane way. But Brazilian football is even more chaotic in its administrative processes than football elsewhere in the world. So you have a situation at Flamengo in 2005-2006 where they've got 8 coaches on the books. 8. They're paying 8 coaches. Only one person is doing the job, but they're paying 8 because they've chopped and changed their coaches so many times, but having to pay them off. And indeed, one of these coaches is sacked earlier in the season and then reappointed mid-season and then sacked again. So they're paying off 2 contracts of that guy. That's the way Flamengo is run. That's possibly one of the worst. In terms of the investment model, until very recently, the policy of the cartolas is not to invest any money in anything. And the state of Brazilian stadiums, which were either built in the great stadium building wave of the 20s, 30s and early 40s, or under the military in the 1970s when some of the kind of very biggest and ugliest concrete things were built as a way of boosting the concrete industry in Brazil, are falling apart. They are actually falling apart. In the Maracanã has collapsed a number of times in recent years. Bits of railing have fallen off, hitting people on the head. I mean, in a way, it is a miracle, and I don't quite understand why, but it is a miracle that more people have not died in stadium disasters in Brazil in the last few years. Just to give again an example of the problems of Brazilian football and the nature of the attitude of the cartolas, I want to take you to 2001, and it is the last game of the season, and it's between Sao Caetano, which is a sort of industrial suburb of Sao Paulo, a small team, okay, up against the big team in the final game, and that's Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese team in Rio. And the score is 1-0, and the stadium is packed. And the reason that the stadium is packed, because it has a natural capacity of, say, 45,000, and there's 60,000 people in the stadium, is because Vasco have just said, we've got a big crowd, they all want to pay, let them in. Okay, so any restrictions on numbers of people on stadium, health and safety issues, stewarding, etc., is all completely out the window. Okay, because, you know, you can get away with it. Because these people never, ever, ever get prosecuted. And if they do get prosecuted, they never get to court, and my God, if they get to court, they don't lose. Okay, so there is a complete disregard. On this occasion, there is a massive crush behind one of the goals. Hundreds of people, barriers that are holding up people on the terraces break, and there is a huge crush of hundreds of people, so large that people are tumbling onto the grass. Okay, and thank God nobody has died, but many, many people are asphyxiated, they have had their ribs broken or bruised. I mean, this is no joke. The game stops. Do Vasco da Gama, who are responsible, call any ambulances? No. They try and cope initially just with the 3 or 4 people, you know, who are there doing first aid. The only reason the ambulances show up is because the governor of Rio State is watching it on the television and calls the emergency services personally and says, you've really got to get down there. So the ambulances get down there, they're all over the pitch, the game has been stopped, and you can see this for yourself on YouTube. Rico Miranda, do remember that name, who for many years was the Cartola and president of Vasco da Gama, a man who is the closest human thing I've come across to a frog or a toad in my life, a truly repellent character, who was also a member of Brazilian Congress in a party that was basically him. There's quite a lot of that, I'm sure you know, in Brazil, of individual parties and senators for sale. And he can be seen walking around this devastation going, get the fucking ambulances off the pitch. And he starts pushing first aid workers and paramedics, get off the pitch, right? Because he wants the game to continue so Vasco can claim the championship. They don't move. So what does he do? He picks up the trophy. There's the trophy at the side of the pitch. He picks the trophy up and amidst this scene of devastation, which he is primarily responsible for, holds the cup up with his players saying, we won the championship. I mean, again, do you laugh or do you cry? You know? But this is the norm. This is the norm. Okay, so that's all pretty bad. It gets worse. Let us consider the issue of violence. As I'm sure you're well aware, Brazil is a very violent society. In many ways, at many levels, in civil society, but the way the police operate, the way the state operates, this is not news to anyone. And therefore, it is not entirely surprising that this is reflected in many ways in the behaviour of fans, players, referees, and officials in Brazilian football. Depending on how you kind of measure these things and how you classify deaths and homicides, somewhere around 180 people have died since 1988 in football-related incidents in Brazil. Many of those are quite a long way from the stadium and involve fights in bars over colours or fights that take on a football dimension. If you look at things that actually happen very close to the stadium or in the stadium, it's merely 48 people that have died. And this is not even taking into account, you know, when you've got that many people dying, how many people are getting injured? How many people are on the end of some kind of violence or another? It requires quite a kind of leap of imagination. And the violence takes many forms. Sometimes it's fighting within the stadium. Sometimes it's fighting between fans. Sometimes it's the fans fighting with the police. And I should say the police's attitude to this has been a mixture of utter negligence or, I would say, sort of shock and awe. I mean, the Brazilian police have 2 years, which is, we don't know what's going on, and then there's the kind of open up with the full battery of violence that is available to them. We have innumerable incidences of fans broken down in buses by the side of the road with the club colours, the other fans pass by on the other side, and people just take a shot. And we are not, as I say, we're not talking about isolated incidents, we're talking about many, 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 many that have been going on. This violence is reproduced on the pitch. I mean, Brazil is the only place I know of, and I'm prepared to be corrected, where I've certainly seen officials kicking and punching players. Right? I mean, that's quite, you know, quite a prospect. I mean, we know about players getting cross and pushing referees. We actually see it the other way around in Brazil. So, an extraordinary level of violence, and as a consequence, and this is the saddest thing of all, the attendances at Brazilian football have collapsed. The average attendance at the Brazilian National Championship is now less than 10,000 as an average at the games. This is minuscule. This is minuscule, and these stadiums are increasingly empty. I mean, it's got so bad, you know, there have been top-level games in Brazil with less than 4 figures in the audience. You know, we're talking 700, 800 for a kind of leading game. So that's pretty problematic and not too great for the atmosphere either. Just one further example of this, you may have seen in the New York Times, I think it was last week, a really great piece by Jan Norman, which followed up a story that emerged earlier on in the year. And he actually did the right thing and went out and actually did the story on the ground. And the story is this. In the northeast at an amateur game, the referee takes a knife with him to the game, and it turns out this is pretty standard form in amateur football. If you're a referee, if you don't take the knife, you might well take pepper spray, because you're going to get trouble. And he did get trouble, and he sent somebody off for 2 yellow cards. And the response of this, of the player who was sent off, was to start a fight with him. And the referee defended himself, and he stabbed him. Okay? That's pretty bad. Wait what happens next. So the friends of the now dead football player get hold of the referee, tie him up, okay, hit him over the head and around his body with a goalpost, drive a motorbike over his body 3 times, stab him through the throat, cut his head off, and then begin to remove his limbs. And do the police come? There's the police anywhere. The police phoned and they don't show up. So this is, you know, I mean, this is really about the machismo of revenge politics, the impact of too much marijuana and cachaça, the desperation of poverty. But nonetheless, this is actually not an isolated incident in Brazilian football. And similarly, the fans, you know, as well as fighting with each other, not a week goes by without a story with fans showing up at the training ground of their club or meeting the team at the airport, you know, and threatening them, or attacking business properties owned by players, particularly restaurants, which is one of the main ways that players will invest their money. All of these things become targets for these for the fan groups, the torcida organizada. It gets worse. There is now widespread cheating in Brazilian football, and I don't just mean the everyday, you know, getting away with what you can against the referee. And it's certainly, you know, I'm sure you know in the rules of football, when a free kick is taken, you have to be 10 yards away from the ball. And of course, in every football culture, people always try and shuffle forward a bit, right? In Brazil, the shuffling forward got so outrageous that they actually introduced disappearing spray paint, and the referees would spray lines on the pitch. It's like, behind that. Okay, it still doesn't work, but there's the technology. But in 2005, the leading referee in Brazil, FIFA registered, was arrested, charged, and eventually convicted of taking bribes of the region of $150,000 for affecting the outcome of 11 really important games over that season. In the Copa Libertadores, which is the international competition, but also in the league. I mean, so bad they actually replayed 11 of the games. The court story, the court cases that came from that were really quite something else. So cheating, match fixing, and perhaps the best of all I saw, and again this is great on YouTube, recently the masseur of the team, this is in the 4th division, is behind the goal of his team, and his team is under pressure. And you know those moments where the goalkeeper is kind of lost on one side, it's an open goal? The masseur runs onto the pitch and makes 2 saves. He makes 2 saves and then runs off the pitch. And this is not an isolated incident. The sense, I mean, you know, it's again that sense of the rule of law does just not apply. Now, all of these things would be by the by, in a way, and a matter and a problem for Brazil and Brazilian society, and of less interest to the rest of us, were it not the case that Brazil is going to be the centre of the kind of global sports stage in the next 2 years, because not only do we have the 2014 World Cup, but we have the 2016 Rio Summer Games coming up. And it's worth noting, I mean, this is part of a bigger trend, because in 2007 Rio hosted the Pan American Games, and in 2013 obviously the Confederations Cup. So this is a planned thing. And why? What's going on? Well, I mean, if you look, it's interesting. Not many places have held the World Cup and the Olympics sequentially. I mean, certainly America, 94 World Cup, Atlanta 96, but that wasn't really a kind of elite government-driven plan. But certainly if you look at Mexico 68 for the Olympics, then the World Cup afterwards, or Munich 72 for the Games and then the World Cup in 74, there's a big political agenda. And the political agenda in Mexico in the late 1960s is we've industrialized, we've urbanized, we've arrived. And in 1972, 1974 in Germany, it's, yes, we know we've been bad and excluded from the global community of nations, but hey, we're cuddly, we're democratic, we're transparent, and we're back. Okay? And this isn't going to look like Berlin 1936, on which they managed to carry off pretty well. So there's a big soft power political message. So what was the message that Brazil and Brazil's elites wanted to give? Where do these big events fit into that program? And as I'm sure you're aware, it's been a very important decade or so in Brazil. You know, since Lula was elected in 2002, though obviously there are roots before this, Brazil has undergone an economic and social transformation. You know, the high priests of global neoliberalism at Goldman Sachs have deemed them sufficiently important to be part of the BRIC group. You know, the rising powers of the global south at a moment where the balance of economic, culture and political force in the global order is shifting. Brazil is part of that. Brazil has undergone the fastest growth rates really since Juscelino Kubitschek was in charge in the late 1950s, and the Brazilian economic miracle version 1 happened. Well, here's version number 2, driven overwhelmingly, it should be noted, by the sale of raw commodities predominantly to China, rather than incredibly successful industrialization or the creation of new service industries. Brazil has kind of slightly reverted to its traditional position in the global order and sold a hell of a lot of soybeans to Beijing, amongst other things. The third thing that they were going to celebrate, I suppose, a part of the message, and again this is really worth noting, is for the first time, the one thing that Lula's regime can say is that for the first time in 500 years, the people running Brazil took some note and gave some crumbs to the very poorest citizens of the nation. And through the Bolsa Familia, which is Brazil's first proper national welfare program, where basically the very poorest get money in the equivalent of food stamps in return for making sure your kids are in school and are immunized. Somewhere between 35 to 40 million of the very, very poorest Brazilians have been raised up to the point where malnutrition, at least, is not totally widespread in those zones. And for all its limits, this is an extraordinary and very, very praiseworthy achievement. Of course, alongside that, something else has been happening. And that is that the rich have got even richer. I mean, Brazil, already one of the most inegalitarian societies with a Gini coefficient off the map, has become more unequal as the very, very rich have scooped up the best of the growth and the development of the last 10 years. And this has left an expanding middle class, and it is an expanding middle class, which has prospered in many ways, very, very dissatisfied in the middle. And the expression that I often heard that sort of summed this up when I was in Brazil was the complaint that we pay European level taxes, but we get Mozambican services, is how they put it. And Brazilians do pay the equivalent of the kind of tax rates you'd be paying in France or Britain, but public hospitals where you take your own toilet paper. Because there ain't going to be any when you get there. And if you're smart, you take your own food and your nursing care. And let's not even go into the kind of public education system, which is profoundly dysfunctional. What else were they going to? Well, oil is coming. The boom looked like it was set to continue. Brazil has also been pursuing a more independent foreign policy under Lula than it has really for 50 years. No longer merely following the lead of the United States. And as we know, they have had political relationships with all of the United States bête noirs, be it Venezuela or Iran or China, but also taken action in the international sphere independently. The peacekeeping force in Haiti, a mixed blessing in many ways, but nonetheless, there is Brazil on the stage, and it's worth noting the Brazilian government has invested in massively expanding its diplomatic corps in the last 10 years. From having a tiny diplomatic corps, it now is really investing money. It sees its place as an actor in the global sphere. So all of these things were going to be projected in some way or another through the shiny World Cup and the shiny Rio 2016 Games. And it's worth just for a moment pausing and remembering we have been here before in Brazil. If we go back to 1950, when Brazil hosted the World Cup for the first time, it was thought of in not dissimilar terms. Here, after almost 2 decades of urbanization and industrialization, of developmental nationalism under Getúlio Vargas's various regimes, Brazil was finally going to show itself to the world. Brazil had finally achieved its place as a modern or modernizing nation, and this was going to be sealed, architecturally by the building of the Maracanã, which, was at the time, and in the historical memory, is one of truly the greatest architectural achievements in football. And the Brazilian team were great, and they were going to win it and show the world. And in the greatest act of hubris ever, I think possibly in the history of humanity, they virtually declared themselves champions before the final game against Uruguay, which they only needed to draw, and they lost it. And they lost it in front of the biggest audience ever for a football match that's been recorded. 250,000 people piled into the Maracanã, which is sort of probably in the region, I don't know, like 15 to 20% of like the adult population of the city. I mean, an extraordinary moment. So just bear that one in mind when you're thinking about the 2014 World Cup. So all of these things, just look at the time, all of these things, this was the plan. That's the new Brazil that was going to be shown through the World Cup and through Rio 2016. And as we know, not one that seems to me to be actually a terribly representative, certainly of the way Brazilian football and Brazilian society more widely works. The great news is they ain't going to be able to pull the wool over anyone's eyes on this one. Because in 2013, at the Confederations Cup, Brazil experienced what to my mind is its largest outburst of social protest ever. Now let me just tell you a little bit about the Confederations Cup first of all. It's a small and fundamentally uninteresting football tournament that is basically designed as a warm-up. Right? It started actually in the 1990s as a favour basically to the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia, who built this unbelievable stadium, where all the taps are made of gold and there are no seats for women, and you can imagine the shtick. And it's like, what are we going to do with it? What are we going to stage here? No one's given to the World Cup to Saudi Arabia in 1997. So they staged the Confederations Cup as a way of kind of placating the Saudis, who are punting up a lot of money in all sorts of ways. And they then realised, maybe we can turn this tournament into a kind of dry run for the World Cup. Check all the systems are working, the stadiums are right. And that begins really 2005 in Frankfurt before the German World Cup, 2009 in South Africa, 2013 in Brazil. And The protests that occurred during this, well, let me just say, first of all, something about their scale. Brazil, of course, has known public protests before. If we go back to 1964, right, in the year of the military dictatorship taking over, we had very large demonstrations in Rio and Sao Paulo, both for and against. If we go to the end of the military regime in 1984, 1985, again, very substantial crowds, again, overwhelmingly in Rio and Sao Paulo, calling for the end of the military dictatorship. When Collor was impeached in the 1990s, that really got people out on the streets and beyond Rio and Sao Paulo. But I would say over the month of June, something in the region of 4 to 5 million people go out on the street at one point or another. And not just in Rio or Sao Paulo, but in every city, large and small in Brazil. And so much of Brazilian politics has been based on Rio, Sao Paulo for so long. And this was everywhere. Fortaleza, Recife, Belém, man, they were protesting in Manaus, you know, right in the heart of the Amazon. So this is a scale not seen before. And what's particularly interesting is where these earlier demonstrations in Brazil were quite conventional. You've got a central organising body. You've got a simple, singular message behind which everybody can get. But that's not what happened at the Confederations Cup. There was no organising central intelligence. There was no one simple yes or for, color in, color out, military yes, military no, but an incredibly complex range of issues that were being engaged with. And without that central organising intelligence, but through a combination of spontaneity, pre-existing small groups, and above all, the power of social media, which, you know, as in Egypt and Turkey and so on, form instrumental in making these things happen. So how did it take place? How does it connect to, how did it actually connect with the football? And what are the consequences or, you know, likely outcomes of all of this in 2014? What will it all ultimately mean? Things start in early June in Sao Paulo. And this is about 10 days before the tournament is due to kick off. And probably the really catalytic moment is the Sao Paulo public transport protests. And it's interesting, normally public transport fees are put up in January when the students are not around. But this time they decided to do it in June, and the students were around. Not a good move by the Brazilian authorities. Plus, there had been protests in Porto Alegre in March, which were not particularly well reported, where they had managed to get the public transport costs lowered. So there was a kind of good example. So they go out on the streets of Sao Paulo, and it's 2,000–3,000 people to begin with. And actually, most Paulistas are looking at it going, this is really annoying. The traffic's bad enough as it is, and you're making it worse. Then the police intervene, and the police go in heavy. They go in tear gas, rubber bullets, the full works. As I say, Brazilian police only have one mode. And that's the moment where people start joining them, right? That's the catalyst. And suddenly it's not just in Sao Paulo, but it's in Rio, it's in Belo Horizonte, it's in Porto Alegre, it's spreading. And it's not just, you know, 2,000, it's 3,000, it's 5,000, it's 10,000. By about June the 8th or June the 9th, you're talking about 50,000 people demonstrating in Sao Paulo. And what is so interesting is how a whole cluster of issues come together and how football is a really important part of that. How does that happen? What are the issues? So we've got public transport, number one. Then we've got the issue of healthcare and education. And as I say, the general feeling amongst the new middle class of Brazil is we're paying European taxes and getting Mozambican services. And this is particularly galling when you've got all of this money being spent on World Cup and Rio Olympics infrastructure. And one of the phrases in Brazilian public life of the last few years is, we have to have FIFA quality airports. We have to have FIFA quality stadiums. And so you get people with banners saying, FIFA quality education, question mark. FIFA quality healthcare, question mark. And there's one particularly good chant, which I can't do in the Portuguese, but it rhymes really brilliantly in Portuguese, which is, hey, hey, FIFA, why don't you pay my bus fare? It sounds much better in Brazilian Portuguese. And then just to top it off, two particular laws that were about to be passed in Congress became a feature of the protest. And again, I think this is pretty typical of the way Brazilian politics has been working. Number one, there's a law which proposes that homosexuality officially becomes a treatable disease. Okay, so that's bad. All right, we know as good liberals, that's bad news. But who is proposing this law? Christian evangelicals in the Senate. And who are the organisations who are going to take the opportunity to treat all of Brazil's sick homosexuals and earn a bunch of money at the same time? Christian evangelical organisations. I mean, it's so cynical and so transparent, but they were on the verge of getting away with it. Similarly, the organisation that's sort of the equivalent of the FBI in Brazil, and the one organisation which has a mandate to investigate corruption in Brazilian politics, Congress is trying to pass a law that takes the power away from them, but doesn't give it to anybody else. I mean, it's so blatant. It's one of those moments. I don't know if you've ever read Ryszard Kapuscinski, the great Polish travel writer, stroke fictionalist, who describes the moment in Iran in 1980. He asks, when's the moment? What breaks the straw that breaks the camel's back? What's the moment where people stop being frightened of the state and its military apparatus and are just so damn cross and so sort of ashamed and so sort of abused that you say, here and no further, or as they say in the Big Lebowski, the Coen brothers movie, line in the sand, dude. When do you draw the kind of mental line in the sand? I wonder whether the marine thing we watched earlier is one of my moments. I wonder whether these laws are those moments as well. So all of these things are being protested about, but the ID, FIFA, the Brazilian football authorities, the waste of money and the way money is being spent at the World Cup becomes central to the chants that are being made, all of the handmade posters that people are using. And very quickly, realising that the Confederations Cup is on, that becomes the thing around which you focus and organise all of these thousands of spontaneous demonstrations. So over the next month, the games themselves provide a kind of rhythm for the protests, and it's like, right, it's a game today, we march on the stadium, right? It gives, what would otherwise be a completely incoherent movement, a sort of structure within which to operate. And as I've said, it crystallises football. Given what I've said about it, can you see that football crystallises in one issue and idea so many of the wider problems that are driving people crazy in Brazil? And this is made all the worse by the way in which the World Cup itself has been organised, which has been little short of a travesty. The first thing to say is that the World Cup sort of falls into Brazil's lap in 2007. They don't really have to fight for it. These days, if you want to get the Olympics, there's a lot of paperwork, right? It's a big operation. But FIFA decided after the Germans got the World Cup in 2006, there was a big argument. This should have been South Africa's World Cup. Blah, blah, blah. So FIFA said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to rotate the World Cup, one confederation continent at a time. And the next one up is Africa. And of course, South Africa therefore won that competition, because they were up against Morocco, and no one was sending the World Cup to Morocco, bless them. So South Africa got it. And the next one was going to be Latin America, South America. And in a classic stitch-up, CONMEBOL, Confederation of South American Football, consulting no one, just said, we're backing Brazil, right? At which point the game is over, right? It's already been decided. The Colombians, just to be irritating, as they often do in global football, thought about having the bid. But, what's your chances? They know they've got that chance. So Brazil get it, and they don't have to work for it. It's given to their lap. The first thing to say about the organisation of the World Cup is that Lula and the PT take a decision pretty early on, like, see no evil. Okay, guys, you get on with it. There is no representative of the federal government on the World Cup organising committee until this year. So they let them go for 6 years without any significant federal oversight of any kind. So there is a real abdication of responsibility. I mean, I can understand, if I was Lula, it's like, oh man, I've got to go and regulate those guys, like I haven't got enough on my plate. You go do. And I think really, literally, that is the way it happened. So that's number one. Number two, The decisions, I mean, I won't go into the kind of the details of much of it, but it's all completely horrific. But let's just look at the stadiums for a moment. Okay, we're all used to the notion of white elephants, but we're talking a herd of white elephants, and very expensive ones. So in Brasilia, okay, I understand, it's the national capital, they need a proper football stadium, it's Brazil. Fair enough, not a problem with that. It cost approximately the same as the bird's nest. You're familiar with the bird's nest? That was the big thing in Beijing. Not a cheap stadium, $700 million. Okay, cheaper than Wembley, but otherwise pretty damn expensive. They spent the same on the stadium in Brasilia. After the World Cup is over, of course, the local team will take occupation. Fair enough, not a white elephant. What do you think the average attendance of the professional team in Brasilia is? Have a guess. This is for an 80,000 seat stadium. Ha! 1,100. 1,100. Okay, that's not bad enough in Cuiabá, which is the capital of Mato Grosso, which is where all the soybeans come from, and where the governor is probably the biggest donor to the PT. They've got a stadium too. A mere $250,000, 50,000 seats. They don't have a professional football team in this city. So you're building a stadium, there's no professional football team. Again, this wouldn't be so bad if matters were just confined to the stadiums. But as is often the case, the building of the stadium is but one element in a very unpleasant process of urban regeneration and change, almost always involving the destruction of what little public space is left in the centre of Brazilian cities, which is divisive and often incredibly ugly. So let's just take the Mineiro in Belo Horizonte, which used to be surrounded by a lot of really beautiful parkland, and where you could go and you could have a picnic and a barbecue and you could hang out, and there was space, right? And you didn't have to go into the stadium and spend all your money with Coca-Cola. All of that completely gone, just completely taken away, and it's now car parks and private space. And this has been happening in a number of occasions. In Recife, it's interesting as well. They built a stadium. The old stadium used to be at least, within a bus ride of the poor parts of Recife. The new stadium is 35 kilometres away from the concentration of favelas and the poor. So incredibly undemocratic. So we've got to the point. All of these demonstrations are going on. Football, the World Cup, Brazil's relationship with FIFA, the nature of domestic football, all coalesce together. I'm going to finish just by showing you a little bit of my own personal experience, because then I was in Brazil for the last week of the Confederations Cup. I was in Belo Horizonte for the semi-final between Uruguay and Brazil, and that was a really interesting experience. They say, and I think rightly so, going to see Brazil these days is like going to watch Sweden. Why? Because it's full of white folks with bleached blonde hair. All right? I mean, Belo Horizonte is where Pelé is from, and it was a 99.9% white audience in that stadium. And that was reproduced in most places, and tickets have reached the point now, it's sort of 3 weeks on the minimum wage to buy a ticket. So it's a this is no longer the game of the people inside these stadiums. It is absolutely, or it's the people, it's a very, very, very narrow kind of section of them. How do I get the PowerPoint up? Do I just go here? Where are we? Is it that one?
Yep.
Okay, good. Can I move this? Can I use this now to control it? In Belo Horizonte, there were two demonstrations. There was a demonstration began in the morning in the city centre. I mean, this was just driving in. You saw that. Brazil plus FIFA, Povo na Merda. I think that means Brazil and FIFA.
People in the shit.
Say again?
People in the shit.
Good, thank you very much. There's also, and the other one they had is the cup kills the poor, was the other thing, all over. And I was on a FIFA branded bus. I have to tell you, the trip from the airport to the city centre was pretty like, people looking at you guys, thinking, I'm on the wrong bus here. So the demonstration gathers in the morning, and this is the morning of the semi-final. And what can we say of this? It's spontaneous. It's overwhelmingly middle class. it's men, but it's women, but it's children. The messages are all the kinds of messages that I've been talking to you about in various humour. And notice the prevalence of the Brazilian flag, the brilliant entrepreneurial genius of the Brazilian poor. They were all thinking they were going to sell their Brazilian flags to football fans in the stadiums. Okay, but they all ended up coming to the demonstrations and selling them at the demonstrations, and people were trying to say, we are Brazil, not the crowd in the stadium, but we are Brazil. The other great thing about these demonstrations is I've been in a lot of demonstrations in my life, but none that were so well supplied with iced beer, water and gas masks. And all the guys, you know, with the little trucks and the trolleys, they're all just walking along in clouds of tear gas, selling their gas masks, selling a beer. Extraordinary. And on this one there were a number of people dressed in full kind of waiters outfits with silver trays. And the drink of the day was Scotch plus Red Bull. And that's what was on offer for a few centavos to kind of get you going. Again, you know, this is, and it's quite small at this point. Can you give us another one, Laurent? She was brilliant, all right? So she must be about 70, this woman. And that is, you know, Brazil, the elderly don't just need vaccines, they need salaries, respect and dignity. It was my bad translation. And that, again, very characteristic of what is going on. Can we have the next one, Laurent? And there is the international dimension of the operation. And there's an awful lot of that going on all over the place. Can we have the next one? Again, against corruption, blah, blah, blah. This is great. This gentleman, well, what's great is this gentleman is the deputy head of media, FIFA, and to his credit, to his absolute credit, and it's worth remembering for all the bad things I've ever said in my life about FIFA, it is also true it's not a monolithic organisation. You know, and there is actually, and that's interesting politically, there is divergence of opinion. You know, there are cracks in the wall. And Alex went out and they ended up being the best of friends, and they had a really interesting conversation about what was going on. Okay, so that day 100,000 people marched up the motorway to the stadium. And the reason they don't get to the stadium is FIFA has a 1 kilometre exclusion zone. Right, for corporate purposes, this is the area where you can't advertise Pepsi because Coca-Cola have already paid up. And that became the de facto battle lines. So in a terrible irony, or maybe not so ironic, you know, it's the FIFA 1 kilometre exclusion zone. Yeah, there we go. FIFA quality education. I love that. And it turned inevitably into tear gas and fighting in a riot, and I'm seeing it's 1:10, so I will wrap up pretty soon. So that was in Belo Horizonte. In Rio, and this is really what I want to say, it's just to think about what will happen at 2014, is I went to 2 demonstrations in a day, such was my enthusiasm. The family-friendly demo, if you leave that one, I'll talk to that maybe in a minute. The family-friendly demo in the morning, and then the cross people in hoodies in the evening. And the evening one in particular is interesting because I expect in 2014, you know, the anti-Olympic World Cup movement, which is actually organised the Comité Popular Olímpico e Copa, are going to be back. A lot of people are going to be back because they know they are getting coverage, that none of the things that have been promised by the elite have transpired, and because they've tasted blood. And in that sense, I don't know about you, but it's really great to see a ruling class look like rabbits in the headlights. And they really didn't know what had hit them. They panicked. They didn't know what to do. And there is a sense, just for once, those guys got caught off balance by this. And I believe very strongly that people will be back for more. So there we are, 5,000 of us, outside 1 kilometre from the Maracanã. And it's worth noting the Maracanã is a river. Okay, and there is, I mean, I don't know whether to laugh or cry. There's a kind of channel. It's been canalised, you know, by concrete, and it's basically untreated sewage. And that's what flows towards the Maracanã Stadium, is a river of shit. And we were standing next to it. So, obviously there's a confrontation. People are standing off against each other. Finally, a cobble is thrown. And the response of the police is 40 cans of tear gas. 20 of them fired into a functioning petrol station full of people. All right? Again, the disregard and contempt for the general public is beyond all measure. And it's worth noting that only medical care available on this occasion was 6 medical students volunteering from Rio University's medical school. That's all that was available. And there I was standing, and I could see the light coming from the Maracanã, and I could hear very distantly, at the beginning of a game, the rise of the crowd. But across the sky of 4 or 5 military helicopters, less than 50 meters above the street, I don't know if you've experienced, that's loud and really, really scary. And possibly something in the order of 3,000 fully armed riot police firing just fusillade after fusillade of tear gas. And I cannot see that this is going to not happen again. I cannot see that the Brazilian police have learned a different model of dealing with public order. I cannot see that people have been calmed down sufficiently. They've tasted blood. I cannot see that they're not going to be back. And while, I love football, I really, really love football, I really love the World Cup, and I'm a kind of completely hapless romantic in some ways about it. I actually do think it is one of the very rare opportunities in which a kind of cosmopolitan, universal human version of humanity is actually demonstrated. And in an incredibly divided world, those things are rare and precious and difficult to reproduce. So one doesn't mess with them lightly, But I have personally reached the point from my study, not merely of Brazil, but the way all of these mega events is, I'm not going to be in the stadium next time. I'm going to be on the 1 kilometre exclusion zone. And if what it takes to get some reform into the governance of international sport, the governance of sporting mega events, and the governance of sport at a domestic level, if what it takes is that the 2014 World Cup has to be played out to the sound of attack helicopters and the fizz of tear gas grenades, then so be it. It's tragically the right thing to happen. And I'm going to leave it there.
We have a little time for questions for those of you who'd like to dialogue, respond.
So, well, in your pictures, I don't know if this is the case or not, but in your pictures it looked like it was the people with middle class that were in the picket lines.
Yep.
And I don't know, did people come out of the favelas, or was it mostly middle
My
class?
experience, and obviously it's a narrow experience, is the only people clearly coming out of the favelas were people who were already politically organised and active, particularly in relation to campaigns against displacement, because lots of people are getting kicked out of various places to make way for sporting infrastructure. Those guys were there. I would say probably in Belo Horizonte, because the march has to go from the city centre to the stadium through the kind of working class zones of industrial Belo Horizonte, people came and joined in, but the energy, the core of the protest is unquestionably middle class, by a long, long, long way. And in the end, the very poor are cautious, I think, in Brazil, because they're the people who did okay in relative terms out of the last 10 years. You've actually, for the first time forever, they've got something to lose. So they're not there yet, is my sense.
Do you know if corporate sponsorships have really fallen off since the June protest? Or if, corporate sponsorships for the Olympics in 2016, seems like that might be a better metric.
All of those deals are stitched up a long time ago. And when you sign up to be the big Olympic sponsors or the big World Cup sponsors, you do it many, many years in advance. Sometimes you do it with 2 or 3 Olympics, 2 or 3 World Cups. So I think at that level, there hasn't been any falling off. What I would like to be is a fly on the wall. Because certainly in the run-up to 2010 World Cup, you actually did start getting a little bit of sponsors pressure over various issues, and them going, this is not, we're not getting actually value here because you're making us look like we're the bad guys. I suspect some of that is going on, but, bless Emirates Airlines. I mean, they don't know how to deal with the Brazilian elites, is my sense. So how much leverage they've really got, I don't know. I would like to think they had more, and I think politically that's one of the pressure points. where protesters need to be applying the pressure and saying is, you're paying up $200 million to look like the bad guys. Don't you think we should be doing it differently? I think there's room for manoeuvre there. But I'm not hearing anything for Brazil 2014 at the moment. The lady at the back, and then the gentleman next time.
I have a question about the federal government representation, but you said that there's now only one person, and I was wondering what difference has that made, if any?
Well, it's quite an, I mean, they put a communist called Rebelo on, who was the sports minister, and who does actually have a real track record of getting on football's case, because he ran the Senate committee back in 2002, which called for the criminal prosecution of 17 of the leading figures in Brazilian football. But here's the rub. Since 2002, how many of those guys have gone on trial? 0. And the Brazilian judicial system, which is, there are people here who know rather more about it than me, but the Brazilian judicial system, the judiciary is really, really messed up. It's a bit like Italy. It's really hard to get anyone to come to trial. Will it make a difference? I'm not seeing any difference at the moment. I'm not really close enough to it. I suspect it will make some difference in terms of PR. But beyond that, I'm not seeing anything concrete happening about the way they plan to stage it or sell it that is any different from where we were 6 months ago.
You mentioned how the protests actually created a rare moment where the ruling class panicked.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that? How did they panic?
Well, first of all, they just didn't know. People just sort of couldn't believe it. Like the quiescent Brazilian public who stood the three-card trick for 20 years. And there was no response. I mean, Dilma doesn't go on air and make a kind of televised speech until the 19th. So it's 2.5 weeks in. And that's because they didn't, I mean, again, my Portuguese Brazilian is not good enough to give you the kind of nuance. But I can read body language, and you can see in the early days of the protest. Well, I'll tell you what's a good indicator of it is Globo didn't know how to deal with it. And Globo knows how to deal with everything. We're all familiar with Globo. The Fox News, but with like even madder hairdos of Brazilian public life. And they were struggling, right? They changed the way they reported the story each day. It was like initially, senseless violence. Then it's, oh, actually, no, we can't do that because it's not really, obviously not quite senseless violence. And it took them quite a few days to work out how are we going to paint these people, and how are we going to do our usual divide and rule thing. So I think that's an indicator of that. So,
I'm guessing that, like in most places, there's a kind of structure around sports. I have no way of knowing. That ranges from professional paid players through semi-pro, should we call them, down to amateurs. I'm interested in knowing what kind of hold the prospect of being a professional football player has on the children of Brazil, and how that prospect, if not fantasy, is used to manipulate their prospects.
Well, I think it's still, it remains for boys. I mean, obviously this is a super gendered thing because Brazilian women's football, although it is, just about professionalised, no one's retiring on it. So for young boys and young men, it remains a powerful fantasy stroke incentive. Brazil, and part of the reason they continue to produce a lot of great footballers is you've got a lot of urban poverty. So it continues to have a lot of hold over a lot of folks, and it's your ticket out if you can, if you can manage it. So that is still, I think, almost as strong as ever. I mean, one thing that Brazilian modernisation has not sorted out is a gigantic residual, desperately poor urban proletariat. And that's great if you're looking for footballers. So that continues to be a really powerful hold. I think it's also a powerful hold on the kind of literary imagination. I mean, Linha de Passa, I think that's how you pronounce it, one of the kind of big Brazilian movies of the last 5 or 6 years, the story of 4 brothers of a single mother in Sao Paulo, and one of them is an aspiring footballer. So it continues in an era actually where filmmakers and writers have been writing less and less about football compared to 20 or 30 years ago. That narrative remains powerful and strong in Brazil, I would say. So,
I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear me say that I thought you ended on an idealistic tone, but not just with the last 3 sentences. But the reason I'm asking is because you see these protests, especially when linked to these sports events, as having a cohesiveness, but also a potential for powerful, like for transformation, right? I tend to sympathize with that, but also the Mexican experience you mentioned is one of massacre, right?
sure.
So the question to you is, do you feel like we're beyond the point where the state and corporate apparatus can actually stage an event that gets silenced?
Yeah, it's a good question.
I think we too quickly assume that we're beyond that, right? You can't hide things away. But
Good question.
Can a World Cup still happen in the midst of massacre, blah, 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 blah?
I think if there's a massacre, there won't be. I mean, the massacre of '68 in Mexico is a kind of, the TV cameras really weren't there. From a British perspective, we know about it because one Guardian journalist was there in the square almost by accident. I think this guy had gone there to report the athletics and suddenly found himself in the middle of that.
Well, it happened before, so that's part of my question, whether
I think, you see, there's so much money riding on it and so much prestige. I think unless something absolutely unbelievable happens, there will be a tournament, there will be 48 games, blah, blah. But I think it will be played out against a background of violence. And then the question is, how violent will the Brazilian police be? I know I keep coming back to this, but they really have not the faintest idea of what they're doing. Just to give you another example of how utterly hopeless they were. After we all got tear gassed outside the Maracanã, we retreated about 300 metres. And the Maracanã area is quite well heeled. And very rarely for Brazil, there was a bar outside everyone's watching the game on the television. And there we were, a group of well-heeled sort of Brazilian patriots watching the game. And then the remnants of the demonstration sort of straggling out after being tear gassed next to them. And I just thought, this is going to kick off, as we say in English. Something's going to happen here. And you actually had the extraordinary sort of sight of one group of Brazilians supporting the Brazilian team, and then one group of Brazilians either saying, turn it off, or supporting the Spanish. And they're chanting against each other. And you just know there's going to be a fight. You know in that situation something's going to happen. There are 25 police, though, there, all basically like this, going like, what should we do? What's going to happen? Now, in England, if that happened, the person in charge would have just gone to the bar owner and said, I'm terribly sorry, you have to turn the television off. Right? And if people want to watch this, you go inside, right? Because that's what's going to happen. Nothing. Nothing. They stood and watched until the fight happened, and then they sort of broke it up. But, that's what we're dealing with. So given, if they really get it wrong, then who knows what could happen. I think that's the kind of wild card, is my guess. And yes, I am, I spend so much of my time being a terrible cynic, that I have to, well, you've got to allow me my utopian moment. Out of this shit, something good might arise. And I know it's not a strong position, but psychologically and emotionally as well as politically, I hope you will allow me my little chink of light. Madam, and then this lady here. Yeah, that's lady here.
I was wondering that one of the interesting cross-sections I saw was Pelé's press conferences during the demonstrations. I was hoping you could speak to that and this kind of especially the question about sort of the national myth of football in Brazil and what happens when Pelé, who is the incarnation of that national myth, basically comes out and says, don't demonstrate,
But that's the nation.
Right.
But he's the incarnation of an incredibly conservative nation.
He is,
who's thrown himself in with the political elite.
But publicly, suddenly, everyone has to accept that. That's what I thought.
Well, I don't think people did. I think Pelé's reputation was really, really harmed by that.
No, they had to accept that he's the incarnation of the national, that they don't have access to him, that he became he looked like a puppet. Speaks about body language.
Yeah.
That he looked like like literally somebody was pulling his arms and legs. So I thought that this was actually a moment when the myth that people had access to Pelé was totally taken off the table, that he was taken away.
I mean, I think that's been in the making for some time. I mean, you know, you become Minister of Sport in Brazil, you know, you're going to get exposed in all sorts of ways, which he did. And he has become increasingly conservative in his sort of, you know, old age. And I just think people, you know, people laughed to a certain extent when he came out and said that, because it was so kind of ridiculous. Get behind the national team, don't protest now. It's like, oh, right-o. You know, you and your millions. I don't think he just looked farcical. So I think it does chip away at those myths. You know, and of course the generation that truly venerated Pelé are growing old and dying. And the new lot are not of the same caliber. You know, there are very few. I mean, it's interesting, Romario, though, has become a senator. And from being a completely, you know, disorganised and irresponsible young man, I mean, he's pretty irresponsible and disorganised now, but he's on the side of the angels. And maybe that's something of the new Brazil and the new Brazilian football. But yeah, Pelé, I think, really showed himself up and will, you know, in the affections of many, he will pay the price.
I'll play the cynic for you. There's another scenario that could roll out, right, rather than massacre, transformational protests, is that nothing at all happens. I was there in August in Rio, and you know, the only remnants of protests I saw was a rather bedraggled Occupy at the end of Leblanc. And so there is the possibility that Brazilians do love their game and will say, well, we did this, and now let's enjoy the World Cup. So,
absolutely. Absolutely. There is a real possibility of that. What I would say counter to that is there has been a lot of protest, but it's just not getting reported. I mean, you know, the teachers' demonstrations in Rio, the demonstrations that have been in Sao Paulo, it hasn't entirely gone away, and the police keep reacting in the same old way. You know, teachers are demonstrating and they're still getting tear gassed. So I think that is still there. I think that the kind of the sort of organised, family-friendly social movement characters will be back. I mean, they were doing it beforehand. You know, they've been empowered this time. They will be back. The question is, how many people will join them? You know, will they get the next, you know, because these things are concentric circles, aren't they? With the kind of core, and then the next level, and the next level, and will they get the next level? That's a question.
It could be like Occupy, right? Well, that's gone away, but it was mobilizing for people to attack their certain areas of the larger amorphous, right, is gone, so perhaps.
The other kind of wild card in all of this is the kind of young anarchist types. And they will be back, you know, and they know, and this is the kind of counterpower in the face of the spectacular, one Molotov cocktail is enough, you know, particularly if you know that the opposition is then going to kind of go nuclear, you know, and those guys will, I mean, I have no doubt, you know, and it's not a politics I feel comfortable with, you know, in any way. I'm not trying to say that I do, but I do think they'll be back, and I almost feel like, you know what? That might not be a bad thing. On the other hand, you know, the depths of Brazilian patriotism and its relationship to the football team is immense. And, I mean, I think all of you who've been to Brazil have probably had this experience where it's hard to maintain a critical position, because every 15 minutes you're going, oh man, this place is so great. This place is so nice. I'm feeling so good and easy. Shall we have a coffee and just talk it over? You know, and then I think for real, it's hard. I think there is that going on. It's an exciting moment in the sense, I don't think anybody knows. You know, I don't think any of the actors know. I think it's unpredictable. Your scenario is entirely possible. I hope not, but I mean, you know, we'll see. If it's a perfectly, you know, legitimate, reasonable thing to be thinking about, I would say, you know, it is the counter argument to the position I put.
We should take one more question. John's been waiting.
Sure.
Two comments. The first one is, I am afraid when you take the glasses of football to speak of a country, it could be a little always the same. When I was hearing you, I was thinking, oh, he's speaking of Italy? Cheating, drug, corruption, violence. Oh, speaking of England, I think that until today they have the best score of the number of dead in one game. And so on and so on. So my question is, what is the country you are describing when you are taking the glasses of football? No, it's not a true country. It's a different country. But what country, I have no idea. And my second comment would be, perhaps that Brazil is offering us this year something completely new, which is the democracy in Brazil is stronger than in many countries who organized the Cup the last year. And perhaps for the first time, the democracy is saying the truth on FIFA. And the democracy is saying the truth on football. You know, and perhaps you see Brazil in another way when you think of that. Be careful of, you know, the exotic image of Brazil. Praia e bunda, they say in Brazilian, in Portuguese. Beautiful women on the beach. It's not that way. You know? Brazil is one of the strongest democracies of Latin America. When you compare Brazil and the US, you know, they had social security for everybody since before the World War II. When you compare with Europe, women were voting at the beginning of the 19th century. And so on and so on. So be careful. Brazil could change something in football this year. That's my opinion.
No, I think that's a really good, you know, when you put the football glasses on, a lot of countries all look the same. I think you're right, the Italian comparison is not dissimilar. I do think you do get national differences though through football that are not entirely imaginary. And I think in Brazil it is, you know, in terms of the way the kind of, you know, business is done and the way the public is treated generally by both state and corporate powers, it's not a bad metaphor for the way things go. On the other hand, I think what I really take from you is one doesn't want to downplay the democratic potential. I mean, I think that's right, and I think that's the other Brazil. And in a way that's, you know, football kind of gave it an outlet in a way that we've not seen before. You know, I mean, I don't know about you, but like Brazilian social movements, I didn't know, you know, it was completely all new to me, that kind of side of Brazil. I knew about kind of Brazilian leftists and Brazilian Trotskyite cells, you know, bless them all. But that kind of, the social movement dimension of it, I think Brazil has shown us something really interesting. And I think you're also right to say, having a democracy, this part of the strength of Brazilian democracy is this an occasion where FIFA has been exposed. And in South Africa was different because basically most of the public, including the very poorest, sort of bought into the idea of the World Cup, and there had been a tradition of making soft power statements about South Africa's place in the world through sport, and very successfully as well. And I think you had a real buy-in from a lot of folks as a consequence. And I think Brazil has been the grit, you know, has thrown some grit into that, because there's enough people who just won't stand for that. A stronger, more mature and sophisticated civil society, rather than, I would say, almost rather than its formal democratic structures. So I think, you know, we all have a lot to thank Brazil for in that regard, you know. I think that, you know, this is, as I say, line in the sand, dude, and the Brazilians have helped us draw the line in the sand and say, enough, you know. And I think that is actually, that is the great contribution.
Well, thank you very much, David. We do have a few copies of his books for sale if you're interested in buying a 900 book.
It's almost like, well, you've done it once.